All right, so John's giving you, there we go. John's giving you a bit of a crash course on the canon of the New Testament, how we got the books of the New Testament, and then just a snippet of that question of the text of the Old Testament. Now remember, we're just giving, that's all we're doing here tonight, is giving you snippets, right? Okay, we're teasing you, because we want you to come back in October, all right? So what I want to talk to you is just give you a kind of the same thing that John just did for the Old Testament text and tell you a little bit about the New Testament text, okay? When we think about the New Testament, we're in a pretty good situation in that we have a lot of evidence for the text. And again, what I mean by the text is what are we translating, what gets into our English Bible, okay? The New Testament is written in Greek, and since most of us don't read Greek, we need it in translation. Well, where do we get the Greek text that we then translate? The main place we get it is from Greek manuscripts, all right? This is the largest category of evidence that we have for the New Testament text. We have around 5,000 plus manuscripts of the Greek New Testament. But it's not just that, we also have translations. Just like we read the Bible in translation, people in the ancient world read the Bible in translation as well. It starts with the Greek translation of the Old Testament, and by the time Christianity comes along, you remember that Jesus told his disciples to go into all the world, right? Well, what happens when you go into a part of the world where they don't read Greek, right? You've got to translate it. So that's what they did. So we have translations of the New Testament and the Old Testament early on into languages like Latin and Syriac. We've already seen a Syriac manuscript, and Coptic, which is an Egyptian language. Other languages like Old Church Slavonic. I have yet to meet somebody in one of these talks who speaks Old Church Slavonic. Anybody here, just in case? No? Okay. I always check, because one of these days I'm going to get somebody. It's going to be exciting. Lots and lots of copies of the New Testament in these translations, especially Latin copies, of course, because Latin dominates church life in the West. And then third is citations. The early church fathers, some of whom you've already met in Dr. Meade's talk, like Origen and Athanasius, folks like this, they are early on writing commentaries on the Bible, on the New Testament. They are writing theological works and quoting it there, okay? And so we can use those to help us get back to the original text as well. Now, the one thing I need to mention before we move on from this slide is the one on the left, our Greek manuscript, is by far our best type of evidence. Why? Because it's in Greek, and that's what the original is, right? So it's closer to it. Whereas with translations, of course, we're dealing constantly with issues of translation, right? And so for just to give you one example, Latin as a language has no article, like our article the. There's no equivalent of the in Latin, which there is in Greek. So you can never use a Latin translation to tell you whether there's an article there in Greek or not, because Latin just doesn't have a good equivalent. Does that make sense? So there's certain limitations inherent in these other languages. The other thing is, you'll notice from my picture, these translations are also written by hand, just like the Greek manuscripts are. So scribes sometimes made mistakes in copying the translations, so you actually have to do the work on the translation first to get back to the original text of the translation, you see, before you can use it to get back to the original text of the Greek. And then the citations, we have the added problem that, you know, the church fathers are sometimes, they quote the Bible, like, I don't want to pick on Jim tonight, but other pastors I've heard of from time to time in the pulpit may not quite remember the text that they're quoting. Do you know what I'm saying? They're preaching and you're kind of in the flow, and you remember some verse, but you don't remember it perfectly, and you quote it. That sometimes happens when they're copying, and we're not always sure. Are they quoting from a manuscript here, or are they quoting from memory? Right? And other times they actually might change the text just slightly to fit their own audience or their own context, right? Not in a nefarious way, but just because that's what they're talking about. Now, to give you a sense of how many we have, I said we have about 5,000 copies of the Greek New Testament, okay? But you have to keep in mind, not all of these are as early as could be, okay? So you have to remember they're spread out over time. And so what I've given you here is a graph showing you the number of manuscripts we have by century, okay? And I've been actually on the less conservative side just because I didn't want to skew the data in my own favor. So if a manuscript is dated to the 2nd or 3rd century, which oftentimes they are dated like that by scholars, I've actually thrown it in the 3rd century column just to not skew it in my own favor. But you can see where we get a huge increase here in the Middle Ages, right? Now, why is that? Well, because think about what's happening historically. In these early centuries, Christianity is just a tiny little religion, right? It doesn't have a lot of clout. And so they're getting whatever copies they can get. But by the Middle Ages, Christianity is dominant in the West, right, and in the East as well, which is where we're getting these Greek ones. In fact, if you want to put a couple things in historical perspective here, this is, this little fellow here, that's Gutenberg, okay? So you can start to see things start to trail off there, not surprisingly. Although, interestingly, look how many hand copies we still have after Gutenberg, People are still copying by hand even after Gutenberg. I figure it's just because they thought, if you had your choice between a printed one and a hand-copied one, don't you want the hand-copied one? It's a lot more exciting. And then this is the Ottoman invasion, the Muslim invasion there of Constantinople the first time. Okay, so there seems to be a bit of a dip there. That's the result of war and invasion. All right, now what I want to do is just give you a quick example of how this works. Dr. Meade's already given you one with the Old Testament. So let's look at how this works. How do we as scholars, how do we take all these manuscripts and where they differ from each other, where they disagree, how do we sort out the differences to determine what's, say, we print in our printed Greek New Testament that then gets translated into your English Bible? Okay, so I want to give you one quick example. This is from Mark 1:1 of that same manuscript, actually, that Dr. Meade already mentioned to you, Codex Sinaiticus from the 4th century. All right, and this is the beginning of what's probably the earliest written gospel, Mark's gospel. And it starts with, at the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ. And then your Bible probably says something like Son of God after that. Okay? But this 4th century manuscript does not have those words, Son of God, unless you look really closely. And you see it there. You see those little letters up there? Those are the words Son of God. And you can see how they're written tiny and between the line. Okay? And so the question that we as scholars have to decide is, well, which one is more likely to be what Mark actually wrote? Did Mark start his gospel telling us that Jesus is the Christ, that is the Messiah, the Son of God, or did he not? Okay? And as you keep reading in Mark's gospel, what you find is, already in the first chapter, Jesus is baptized. You remember this? He's baptized. He comes up out of the water. And the voice from heaven says, "This is my beloved," what? Son. Yes. And then the next person, or next group, you might say, that recognizes that Jesus is the Son of God is, interestingly enough, the unclean spirits that he's casting out. And then climactically in Mark's gospel, the person who recognizes Jesus as the Son of God is a Roman centurion at the cross who sees the way he dies and says, surely this man was the Son of God. Are you with me? Now, so there's no doubt as to whether or not Mark thinks Jesus is the Son of God. But there is a question, because of this difference in the manuscripts, as to whether or not Mark wants us to know that right from the beginning, or whether he wants us to see it as we go. Does that make sense? Okay, so that's essentially the question at hand here. Now, we know two things about scribes, all right, from our study of manuscripts. One is that we know sometimes scribes had a penchant for expanding names and titles for Jesus. Okay, so sometimes you'll find, say, one manuscript says, Jesus said or did something. Another manuscript may say, Jesus Christ did it. A third one may say something like, Jesus Christ our Lord. And the fourth one really got excited and said something like, Jesus Christ our Lord Almighty, praise be to him. You know, this kind of a thing, okay? Sometimes scribes could do this, all right? And I could show you examples of this where clearly we don't think the longer version is original, but scribes, just simply because they knew Jesus as these other things, they were sometimes tempted to expand. So some people think the original reading is the shorter one, where Mark just introduces him as Jesus the Messiah and doesn't call him Son of God. And that scribes are the ones who've come along later and added the title Son of God, all right? That's one explanation. Another explanation is that if you look closely, you'll see these letters here, the big letters that look like our capital letter Y. Do you see those? With line, actually have a line over them. Those are the Greek letter upsilon. And if you look at the little letters written between the lines, you'll notice some letters that look like the exact same. They also look like those English letter Ys. Do you see those? Again, the letter upsilon. And one of the mistakes that's very common among scribes, this happens in Hebrew, by the way, it happens in Greek, it happens in Latin, it happens in any language that's hand-copied, is when you have similar letters involved, scribes sometimes accidentally leave it out. And to appreciate this, you have to understand how scribes copied, do you see? Because they're not opening the Xerox machine, putting the manuscript on and hitting you right? What are they doing? You have a manuscript over here on your left, the scribe, and then you have your blank one over here on your right. And you have your pen. You dip your pen in the ink, you read the text over here, then you go over here and you start copying, yeah? Now what happens if the part over here that you're copying from, the last word ends in, say, an upsilon or a series of upsilons, and you copy that over here, you're going to go back and your eye is going to try to find those same upsilons. But if you have a repetition of upsilons, yeah, a repetition of the same letters, your eye may go back to the wrong one. And if you go back to the wrong one, you start copying from that point on, and what you end up doing is leaving out what came before it. Are you with me on this? Okay. So it's a very common mistake, very easy to make, all right? And I happen to think that's actually the explanation here. Others disagree with me, but I'm right, so let's just leave it at that. No, but why do I think that? Because, partly from my own experience, a number of years ago, I spent some time in Italy and got to spend some time with this particular manuscript from the 14th century. It's a complete copy of the New Testament, actually, which is relatively rare. We don't have a lot of those. And I always point out when I show this slide, I don't speak very good Italian, so they either told me at the library, you may take photos, or they said you may not. I'm not sure. But if we could just keep that between us, that would be great. Okay. But anyways, what I want to show you is this is the opening of Mark's Gospel. And if you look over here on the right, this is the word Christ here that I've circled. And then if you look just kind of next to that red circle, you'll see this kind of weird shape. That's not actually a Greek letter there. Okay? Kind of looks like a vertical bar, and then it's got two other lines on the top and bottom. That's just a reference mark. Because if you look over here in the margin, you'll see the exact same shape. You see that? It's just a reference mark. It's like a footnote, if you will, but in the margin. And you want to guess what he's written out here? Son of God. Oh, see, you guys have already got this. You guys are good. All right. Now, what's interesting about this manuscript is as I spent time with it that day, I went through the whole thing, and on page after page after page, I found corrections like this out in the margin. Yeah? Now, this is important. We can pause here and think about something important that this teaches us. All you have to do is understand what's happening here, and you can already answer one form of criticism that's sometimes made against the Bible, and that's what I think Dr. Meade already alluded to it. It's this idea that the Bible's copying was like the telephone game, right? It starts here with this scribe, and it just gets progressively worse the longer you go. The problem is, I don't know how you played the telephone game as a child, but when I played it as a child, there's no point in the game where somebody down the line gets to stop and say, you know what, that makes no sense, what you just told me. I'm going to go back up here and jump the line and see what the first or second guy said. Are you with me? Like, you just don't do that in the telephone game. But that's exactly what can happen in copying, you see. Scribes could correct themselves. Did they make mistakes? Yes. In fact, as I often say with this particular scribe, he was not the best scribe. Because as I say, page after page I found these mistakes. But he was a decent corrector, right? He caught many of his mistakes. And by the way, for what it's worth, many of the mistakes he corrected, I noticed they involve this kind of mistake where it's similar letters at the end of the word that caused him to leave things out. So if you were to jump down the page, same manuscript, same page, look what's happened again. Whoops. Whoops. Now, what I love about this particular one is, again, you can see, notice, by the way, it's the same letter. It doesn't look like our capital Y anymore, but it looks like our U. That's an upsilon again, okay? And you can see what the last letter is over here. You see that? Upsilon again. So the same type of mistake, okay? Now, as I say, what I love about this one is he went back and caught his mistake, and I don't know if you can tell, but he started to fix it up here. And then apparently realized, ooh, whoops, that's a bit longer of a mistake than I realized. It's not going to fit there. Scratched out that correction and then wrote the rest of it here in the margin. Do you see? By the way, he's got another correction here and another one here. You see that? As I say, not a great scribe, but a decent corrector. All right? So I think the original reading in Mark 1:1 is that Mark says Jesus is the Messiah, the Christ, the Son of God. And I think later scribes came along and just made a very simple but very common accidental mistake here where they left out the word Son of God because of the similar letters involved, right? So that's it. Now, I want to bring up one other point that's sometimes made in criticizing the New Testament and its copying, and that is that people sometimes point out that, as Bart Ehrman, who's a New Testament scholar at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, he is an expert in this field, in fact, in his introduction to the New Testament, which is the kind of introduction that students would use in their undergraduate courses at ASU, he says, the earlier we go in the history of copying the New Testament text, the less skilled and attentive the scribes appear to have been. All right? Now, I don't actually want to disagree with him on that. I think he's basically right on that the earlier you go, the scribes are not as good as the later scribes. Partly that's because later the scribes tend to be working in a controlled environment like a monastery, right? Where things have gotten a bit easier for them, okay? They're also a bit more professionalized at that point, some of them, okay? But I want you to think about the logic here of this, okay? Because where you could go wrong is read something like this and think, okay, the earlier I go, the worse it gets. Do you see? And so it's going to get worse and worse, but that's not really how these kind of comparisons work. And to make the point, I want to just ask a little question here. I always like to split the room at these things. See who's younger than me and who's older than me. All right? Because if you're my age or older, you know clearly, beyond dispute, that the answer is Michael Jordan is the better basketball player. Yes? This is clear. However, if you're younger than me, you may have a different answer. It'll be wrong, but it'll be different. Okay? But here's what I want you to think. If I were to say to you, LeBron James is the worst basketball player. He is worse than Michael Jordan. That would be objectively true. But wouldn't it also be really silly to then conclude from that he's a bad basketball player? Yeah, it'd be really stupid, right? So that's what I want you to see is in that logic, just because the earlier scribes are not as good as the later ones does not actually mean that they are bad, right? It's a comparison, yes, but it doesn't mean that to be worse than somebody else who's good makes you necessarily bad. And in fact, I don't think most of the early scribes, not all of them were great, but in general they were quite good. All right, so that's just a kind of a crash course on the copying of the New Testament. Of course, we could say a lot more if we had time. I do want to just mention, John and I have already mentioned this website. We'll say more about it probably in the Q&A, but there's all kinds of articles you can find at textandcanon.org on this question of how we got the Bible. And anytime I talk on the text of the New Testament, people always want to know about the woman caught in adultery and whether she belongs in the Bible or not. Why? Because our earliest copies of John's Gospel don't have that story at all. And even later you go, we have hundreds of manuscripts later, even into the Middle Ages, that don't have it at all. Others which have little notes saying things like, this story is not found in early copies, that kind of thing. Okay? So it is a question. You can read that article if you want. All right. But now we are ready to transition. I want to talk to you about something that's a little bit closer to home, and that is your English Bible. Okay? We've talked about the books of the New Testament. We've talked about the text of the Old Testament briefly and the text of the New Testament. But then how do we get translations? And how does translation actually work? So I want to give you a very brief overview of the history of English Bible translation. All right? I've skipped over in this slide, I've skipped over the important translations of John Wycliffe. His followers produced the first translation of the Bible into English, but it's done in the 14th century. And at that point, Latin is still the language of the West, the Western Church. And so that's what that Bible is translated from. Okay, so the first complete Bible into English is not translated from the original languages, Greek and Hebrew. It's translated from Latin. All right? And then William Tyndale is the next person who's unfortunately also not on this particular slide because I had to cut him out for time. All right? But he's the first person to start translating the Bible from the original languages. Okay? He translates the whole New Testament from English. In fact, he manages to do it twice. He gets started on the Old Testament. I don't know if you've noticed, the Old Testament is a little bit bigger than the New Testament. So he doesn't finish it because before he can finish it, the authorities in England managed to capture him. And they were not fans of the English Bible translation at that point. And so they arrest him, they put him in jail. He's in jail for a while, for months and months. And then they strangle him, and then they burn him at the stake. Why? For translating the Bible. And it's worth stopping at this point and just reminding us that we have a Bible to read in our own language, and we have wonderful translations to read because of the sacrifices of so many who've gone before us. And I hope if you leave with nothing else tonight than this, you leave with a sense of appreciation and gratitude for the Bible that you have, right? People like Tyndale have sacrificed a lot for us to have it. All right, fast forward a bit, though, from Tyndale, and here in the 16th century, the main thing I want you to see in this chart is that the King James Version is all the way over here on the end in 1611. And there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and I've left off a few, English translations before the King James. And the other thing I want you to notice about this slide is that all the translations in orange are actually revisions of something that came before. And so I want to make 2 points about that. One is, oftentimes people have a misconception that the King James was maybe like this first Bible translation after Tyndale, and it's not. There's a lot that comes in between. And then second, people sometimes think that, today we have so many English translations, and that's never been the case before. But in fact, if you were living in 1611 when the King James came out, you would have had plenty of options. Yeah? Okay? Now, maybe you couldn't afford to have them all, the way we can. And you certainly didn't have an iPhone that you could pull them out and download them for free like we can. But you did have options, okay? And then the third thing I should probably mention is that, again, notice that the King James itself is not a fresh translation, okay? Most translations in history, especially in English, because we have such a rich heritage of Bible translation in our language, are revisions, not completely new translations. And I'll let you in on a little secret as to why that is, because translation is a lot of work. The Bible's a big book, and you've got to know Hebrew well, and you've got to know Greek well to do it, and there aren't a lot of people. You think Tyndale's really one of the last people to try to do it all by himself, right? Today it's almost always done by a committee because it's such a big task. And even then, the committees usually make it easier on themselves by starting with a previous translation and trying to improve it, right? In fact, if you were to read the preface to the reader in the King James Version, they would tell you explicitly that they did not intend or they did not think that all translations that came before them were bad and that they were fixing them. Rather, they felt that they were taking them and just improving them. So they say explicitly, we're not trying to make a good translation out of a bad one. Rather, we're trying to make a good one out of many good ones. Does that make sense? A principal good one, they say. All right, so just for some perspective, there's William Shakespeare. Keep in mind, he does not use the King James, all right? King James is not the Bible of Shakespeare. It wasn't around yet. All right? There's King James. All right? We gotta give him some respect, okay? Having knocked him down a peg, let's respect him. All right? This is a King James. It's a massive book. If you've ever been able to see a facsimile of one, or maybe if you're lucky enough to see an original, it's a very large book. All right? Notice Dr. Meade didn't talk about the Apocrypha tonight because he did the New Testament canon instead of the Old. But you'll notice, if you can read, I don't know if you can read, it's pretty small, but right before the New Testament is the end of the Apocrypha. The 1611 King James Bible, like pretty much all English Bibles printed at the time, included the Apocrypha in a separate section from the Old Testament and the New Testament, yes, and oftentimes with clear indications that this was different and shouldn't be read in the same way as the Old or New Testament, but still included there between the same covers, all right? So keep that in mind. Here's just a picture of the King James Reviser's notes. They had a list of about 11 principles they were to work from in translating. And as I said, they didn't make a fresh translation. They worked from their predecessors, and this is actually the only copy we have of what's known as the Bishop's Bible, which is what they were told to start from. That was their starting point. And they then, you can see the actual handwritten notes that they've made there in crossing things out or revising things. It's pretty amazing. We actually have probably more evidence of the process of translating the King James Bible than probably any other English translation, certainly from that period. It's really remarkable. All right, to fast forward to today then, this gives you a sense of one of the amazing things that happens with the King James is for about 250 years, it is the Bible in English. Now you should know it had some help. As we saw, there were other competitors at the time, but when you have the king on your side, one of the nice things that he can do is say, you're not allowed to sell other Bibles, and that's what he did. So we should probably remember that King James had some help in becoming the dominant English Bible. But it does, and it's not until around 1900 and 1881 that we finally get a revision of the King James in what's known as the Revised Version, and that really opens the floodgates again in English. People start to think again, you know what, maybe we could improve the King James, and maybe we should, and so they do. But again, I want you to notice how many of the translations that are on this slide are orange. Again, meaning that they are revisions, not fresh translations. If I were to draw a line, you could go King James, Revised Version, RSV, NASB is a revision of that further, New King James is, NRSV is, and ESV is. All of those are in the King James line. It's a testament to just how good the King James was. It's also a testament to just how prominent it was as the only Bible in English, right? That if you want to make a new translation, even in the year 2000, around 2000, if you can go back to the King James, you have a better chance of getting people to read your new translation. It's pretty amazing, right? All right, again, sorry, just for reference, the Reds won the World Series. We hoped the Bengals would win the Super Bowl this year, those of us from Cincinnati, but alas, that one did not age well. Like 3 points, folks, come on. 30 years since we were in the Super Bowl, so we'll take it. All right, let's not get distracted, though. All right, very briefly, I want to talk about translation philosophy. We could say a lot more about this, but you've probably heard the spectrum of word for word to thought for thought in terms of translations, all right? I want to try to put a little bit of a twist on that in your mind and the way you think about translation philosophy and differences in translations and say the root issue is much broader than that. It's, do we pull the Bible into our world, or do we pull our world into the Bible? Because it's much more than just finding an English equivalent for a Greek or Hebrew word. There are all kinds of terms and even, say, ideas or cultural things that are in the Bible that we have to think about what to do with when we translate. What, for example, is a kinsman redeemer? Or what is a Leviathan? How long is a cubit? Right? How much is a denarius worth and how much can it buy? Translators have to think not just how do we put that into English letters, but do we try to give an equivalent, like should we say something like a penny instead of? Do you see what I'm saying? And there's risks with doing that as well, all right? Martin Luther, as he often did, put his finger on the issue. His own German translation was very famous, all right, very important. Look at what he says. I mean, this is classic Luther, like, Luther. Okay, now to be fair to Luther, in context, which I didn't have space to give you here, he's talking about how to translate Hebrew idioms into German. And he really struggled with Hebrew to get it in. All right? But this is the issue. We would all look at this and say, no, Luther, Moses must be Jewish. Right? But if you want to make him completely Jewish, then the thing to do is not translate him at all. Right? The most Jewish Moses can be is in Hebrew. So even the very act of putting him into a different language, we are already moving from his world, Moses' world, to ours. And so translation is always a question of how much do we try to pull the Bible's world into ours and our world into the Bible, okay? We could say a lot more, but I think we'll leave it at that, okay? So just really quickly, why do we have so many translations in English today, so many choices? One is we've already looked at some textual changes. Dr. Meade showed you one since the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, right? Luther didn't have access to that. The translators of the King James didn't have access to the Dead Sea Scrolls, so today we update our English Bibles with new discoveries. Changes to the English language. I don't have a slide, but when Paul says, I was stoned in 2 Corinthians, that's not going to work today. It's not going to work. Sorry, folks. We got to change it. Theological concerns have always been an issue. And by the way, there are very few issues or arguments about translation that are truly new. There is precedent for almost all of them. I could show you debates between Jews and Christians in the early centuries where they are arguing about translation, say, for example, of Isaiah 7:14, and whether it's a virgin who conceives or a young woman who conceives, yeah? These debates go all the way back. New audiences, translators and publishers often come along and say, can we reach a new audience with this? The original NIV was designed for about a 7th grade reading level, and after a few years, when they saw the success of it, they actually revised it further into what's called the NIRV, the New International Readers Version, and they made it for a 3rd grade reading level. It was specifically designed for people where English was not their first language, right? So it's to reach a new audience. And then lastly, I hate to say it, but money is a reason. Now, maybe not in the way you think, but because if you look at your English Bible and you open to, say, the very first page, or maybe the page after the title page, you'll see the copyright page. I suspect you've not read it. It doesn't make the most interesting reading. But if you were to read it, you would find, along with the copyright date, you would find a statement saying something to the effect of, you are allowed to quote X number of verses without permission. Yeah? And then, once you start quoting more than that number of verses, you've got to write to the publisher and ask them if you can keep using it. Now, for you and I, that's probably not a big deal. But if you're a publisher and you publish books that is like Bible study curriculum, commentaries, Bible handbooks, and that kind of thing, guess what? It's not going to be long before you are quoting more than that number of verses that you're allowed. And that means at some point you're going to start paying royalties to a different publisher. And that means you are now losing money on your own books. Does that make sense? So lots of publishers like to have their own Bible translation, and I could go through the list and show you that Crossway has its own. Let's see, Zondervan has its own, essentially, with the NIV. Broadman and Holman has theirs, and so that's a reason. Again, if you want to learn more, you can go to our website. I think we should probably stop here and do Q&A. So let me stop there, and we'll see if we can open it up for questions. I think we've got about 15 minutes. Is that right, Jim? Yeah. So let's do about 15 minutes. I don't think we have a roaming mic. We do. Okay. So if you have a question on any that I know, that's kind of a high-flying overview.
Oh, I see a hand in the middle, though.
Questions.
I got a question. How does all this information you're learning and telling us about affect your belief in the Word of God?
Well, I'm more confident in the Word of God, since it didn't just sort of fall out of heaven on a sheet. And I feel like now it's a more informed view of how we got the Bible. So I We could go back to that initial slide, talk about the divine inspiration, without error, sufficient authority, right, for our faith and practice. And I look at the humanized side of things, and I go, well, it's messy sometimes, right? But oftentimes if I get caught looking at a mosaic or a tapestry, right, say one corner of it, I'm a little bit too fixated on that. I need to step back and look at the whole, which is what we've tried to do here, like with a really wide-angle lens here tonight. You start to then appreciate the different contours, and you can start to appreciate God's providential superintendence, again, over scribes, church leaders, right? Churches, synods, councils, over many, many centuries, right? And this is how we get our Bible. So I look at that and I go, it's actually a robust view of God's sovereignty, and I now see I have a greater appreciation not only for the book itself, but for now how we got it. So I hope that helps. Yeah, great question.
I was wondering about. I had a class the other day, and we were reading Daniel, and they said that half of Daniel was written in Hebrew and half was written in Aramaic. Did Aramaic play any role at all? Because you just mentioned Hebrew and Greek.
Yeah. So, great question. So we would take the view that the book of Daniel is written during the Babylonian exile, where Aramaic is kind of the lingua franca. So it's really no surprise that half the book of Daniel is written in Aramaic. There are some pieces about the language that actually aid interpretation in places. We could talk about details later, but yeah, I mean, Aramaic definitely has to be included under one of the languages, right, that the Bible is written in, because half the book of Daniel is written in Aramaic. Yeah, it's good.
We sometimes don't mention just because we forget.
That's true. Yeah.
There's not a ton, but so it's easier to just say Hebrew and Greek.
Great question.
I
Yes,
have a
ma'am.
question. Do we have any manuscripts that are contemporaneous to the author or an author?
From the ancient world, a few, though they're very rare.
Don't we have a first century Mark fragment?
He's baiting me. No, we don't. Not for the Bible, no.
Brutal.
And that's not surprising. The one chart I left out on the slide was to compare the New Testament manuscripts to other ancient literature. So let's take Gospel of Thomas, which is a good example because Dr. Meade mentioned it. If you were to put the Gospel of Thomas next to Mark, we have over 1,600 copies of Mark's Gospel. Our earliest copy now, which I didn't have a slide of, but it's from the 3rd or 4th century. Sorry, 2nd or 3rd century. The Gospel of Thomas, we have 4 copies total. So 1,600 for Mark, 4 for the Gospel of Thomas. Okay. The earliest copy of the Gospel of Thomas is actually a little bit earlier than our earliest copy of Mark, right? But it's fragmentary. The first complete copy is the only complete copy we have of the Gospel of Thomas, and it's in a Coptic translation. So the reason why that's important is because if you want to be if you're tempted to have skepticism about the New Testament on this front, on this issue, nothing else comes even close to the Bible in terms of quality and quantity of evidence. Does that make sense? So the short answer is no, we don't. We wouldn't really expect to, though, because they wore out. In fact, the only place we have our oldest manuscripts from, of the Bible are from very dry and arid climates, kind of like ours here, right? As soon as something like papyrus, which these earliest ones are written on, gets wet, it starts to deteriorate once it dries out again. And so you use it, and it's like, it just gets worn out. So, of the New Testament? Of any book. You want to do old and I'll do new?
Yeah, I'm trying to think. Our earliest Dead Sea Scrolls date to of biblical books
Can you explain the Dead Sea Scrolls as opposed to the MT?
Of course. So, so the Dead Sea in the land of Israel, on the northwest corner of the Dead Sea was a spot called Qumran, some 12 caves. Where probably a group called the Essenes lived and worked, primarily in copying manuscripts and writing books, okay? But some 220 fragments of manuscripts coming from Qumran representing biblical books and texts, okay? Does that make sense? Okay. The earliest of those are dated to the 3rd century BC, okay? So let's just say 250 as a round number. That'd be the oldest, okay? We do have something called silver amulets from a place called Hetef Hinnom. These are like silver tablets, and they would sort of be worn as a necklace, okay? And they contain the biblical text of Numbers 6, 24 and 25, the Aaronic blessing, right? But it's not really a biblical text, but that's the oldest of anything biblical that I know of. And that dates to, say, 450 BC, okay? Just as a round number.
For the New Testament, it's about 2nd century, so you're talking about 100 years or so after the apostles wrote them. Question here? Yeah. Mhm. Yeah. Sure. You want me to take that?
Well, just,
Oh, yeah, sure. So he's saying most of our doctrinal statements, and I assume it did in yours, say something like the Bible is inerrant in the original autographs, meaning in the first manuscripts. Okay? Autograph means copied by yourself, so it means the author wrote it. So he's saying if we're saying the Bible is inerrant in the autographs, but we don't actually have them, which is what we've just said, then kind of what good is that? Is that your question? Or conversely, yes.
right. So I think the best way to answer that is all copies have mistakes, right? All copies have mistakes. The question is, if you are able to group and collate and compare all copies, could you use that, even though some have mistakes, right, and some don't? Can you use all that data to reconstruct, right, the autograph or the original text? So the science and art of textual criticism, kind of like what I was trying to show with that Isaiah 53:11 example, right? There's a whole lot of manuscripts that omit that word light. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean there's an error in the autograph. That just means there's an error in that copy, right? But we actually have copies that preserve the original text there, and we can use those copies, right, to correct the later manuscripts. Does that make sense? So textual criticism is really vital so that we can establish the earliest wording of the biblical text themselves.
Yeah.
And again, classicists do this, right? This is not just a biblical studies venture. All humanities that study ancient text rely on the work of textual critics in order to get...
Even Shakespeare scholars have to do it.
If you study Handel's Messiah, you are studying the different copies of Handel's Messiah. Absolutely.
Yeah. The other thing I can tack on to that is keep in mind when we talk about inerrancy, oftentimes the kind of mistakes we're dealing with in the manuscripts do not rise to the level of anything like a theological error.
Right, that's true.
Think about Dr. Meade's example of he will see light, right? We had that reading in the Septuagint, but then we didn't have it in Hebrew until the Dead Sea Scrolls, which were discovered in 1947. Okay. So for hundreds of years, Christians are reading Isaiah 53 without that word there. Does that mean they didn't know about the resurrection? Of course they did, right?
Right.
But so what
Exactly.
happens over time is we discover more manuscripts, we have more evidence, some things become clearer.
Right.
Do you see? But it's not as if before 1947 we didn't know that God had promised that the Messiah would be raised from the dead.
Right.
Right. So kind of keep that in mind.
I think what hopefully something you're picking up on is, as Christians, we shouldn't be afraid of the evidence. In fact, Dr. Gurry and I are like checking new manuscript catalogs every quarter, wondering what new data is there out there. Because the more evidence that we have, what actually ends up happening is the more certain we become of the original text, you see, which is a fascinating development. But I'd say that's developed, at least in the era of the New Testament, over the last century and a half.
Yep.
So, yeah. Oh, right here.
I may not need that, but, okay. So I have a question for you about Hebrews. I had just heard recently, so I'm over at Redeemer, and I had just heard recently about Hebrews. The pastor thought that Hebrews was written by Paul, and that was the first time I had ever heard that. And so 2 questions. Do you think it was written by Paul? And then after reading those 4 requirements, who was the other options?
Okay. Yeah, real quick. I say this with fear and trepidation because almost all early Christian comments on Hebrews, almost all, think Paul wrote it. Okay, almost all. And the big ones too, like Origen, right? We have a better understanding of when, did Origen say only God knows who wrote Hebrews, right? I used to read that and go, oh, Origen didn't think Paul wrote it, only God knows. But really what Origen was espousing there is that, no, Origen thought Paul wrote it, but he wrote it through an amanuensis, and only God knows who that person is. Do you see what I'm saying? He actually didn't doubt that Paul wrote Hebrews, but through an intermediate hand.
An amanuensis is a scribe. Someone was writing down what he said.
Yes, right. Through an intermediate scribe. That's right.
Yeah.
But when I read Hebrews chapter 2, verses 1 to 4, the author to the Hebrews himself seems to say he's second generation. So they have this initial testimony about the Christ and his word coming to the apostles. He seems to be associated with the apostles, right? So he does meet the criterion of apostolicity, either written by an apostle or an associate. Hebrews could still fit that criterion. But yeah, I actually don't think Paul wrote it. So that's, yeah.
You want me to add anything, or you're good? Yeah, I mean, I don't think...
She's trying to... Good work.
Well...
Yes.
No, I also don't think Paul wrote it. But he's right. Yeah, the early church, most of them did think he... I mean, the thing you have to remember is Hebrews doesn't actually identify its author. That's why there's an issue. It's not like Romans where he says Paul, an apostle too. So actually the early church had to explain that. And the way they explained it was, well, he's writing to Jews, and they had heard about him, and they weren't big fans of him, so he keeps his name off of it so that he can get a hearing.
Yep.
You see? So they had to explain that.
Right.
But
they also knew, too, like this is something that's really important to know about early Christian, like Bible scholars. They understood that Hebrews didn't read like the other letters.
That's right.
So they had all kinds of theories. Maybe it was a translation of a Hebrew book. Or, maybe it was an intermediate, writer as Paul is telling him what to write. But the intermediate guy is writing it in his style. Do you see what I'm saying? So it's really fascinating to me. Like a lot of modern commentaries, sort of they sound all sophisticated and contemporary and modern, but all those methods are anticipated by these early Christians who knew about all these problems, right, before modern scholarship came and told us about them. Do you see what I'm saying? So all of them and all the issues anticipated.
Yeah. And Luther doesn't think he wrote it, right?
No, Luther doesn't think he wrote
Luther
it.
doesn't think he wrote it.
No, that's right.
So it comes back to the surface in the Reformation period where people start to ask about it again. Yep. Very back.
In the back.
Okay, so I know Jesus quoted from the Old Testament, so I feel like that gives me a pretty solid burden of proof that the Old Testament is canonical. How can I know that the epistles are scripture and canonical and not just edifying letters? And how can I know that the Gospels are also canonical and not just historical accounts?
That one.
So if I am understanding the question rightly, Jesus is the final authority on the Old Testament canon, okay? So what he quotes, we can take as divinely inspired scripture, okay? That would then go for what the apostles quote then, I guess, right? We could take to be divinely inspired scripture, right, if we're talking about the Old Testament. So the question is then, how do we then fast forward through, now we have New Testament books that how do we know they are given the same status? Is that right? Is that a fair? Like the same status as the Old Testament books, divinely inspired. Okay. Well, I think the best argument for that is kind of this leading metaphor is, again, Jesus is the shepherd, and the sheep are always trying to discern his voice. Okay? What's going on here on the canon question is how often and how many different pockets, geographically speaking, and even chronologically speaking, can we isolate, say, the number of times the gospel according to Matthew is quoted, right, as scripture, right? You see what I'm saying? By the earliest Christians themselves. So when you actually start to run those numbers, what you see is that from a pretty early time, like in documents known as the Apostolic Fathers, these would say date from, let's say, 100 to 200, okay, just as kind of a round figure. The vast majority of our 27-book New Testament is quoted as Scripture with an attribution to one of the apostles. Does that make sense? So the same method that you'd be using to establish the Old Testament canon, right, based on number of citations, we can actually do for the New, okay, as we fast forward. And then you can contrast those numbers with, say, how many times is the Gospel of Thomas quoted? Oh, well, not hardly. And when it's mentioned, it's usually negative. You see what I'm saying? So that we can actually do that fairly scientifically, right? And it actually bears out the final conclusion that we see, later in the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th century canon lists themselves. You see, so the citations of books actually start to anticipate which books will be recognized as divinely inspired, say, a century later.
And remember that you
Does
have.
that make sense?
Remember that you have certain New Testament books that put other New Testament books on par with the Old Testament.
Well, that's true. Yes.
So 2 Peter, for example, puts Paul's writings on par with the other scriptures already. And I'm trying to think, is it one of the pastorals that quotes Luke's gospel right alongside?
Yeah, there's maybe a saying of Jesus there.
Right alongside
Yep.
the Old Testament. So the early church is looking at this and going, okay, we're going to accept those writings that have apostolic authority. That's the key, is apostolic authority. So something like, it's not just do we like it.
No.
That's what Dr. Meade was trying to say with the Shepherd of Hermas. The early church loved the Shepherd of Hermas, but they clearly rejected it as canonical. Why? Because it's written too late to be written by an apostle or his associate.
Right.
So Mark's gospel, for example, nobody in the early church thinks an apostle wrote it. So how do they accept it? Because they all consistently say it's Peter's preaching of the gospel in Rome, written by Mark, his close associate. Does that make sense? Okay. So you get to these other gospels, like Gospel of Thomas. Nobody thinks they're actually written by an apostle or a close associate. So that becomes a very clear dividing line for them.
Exactly.
Good.
Yeah. That's good.
Yeah.
Yeah, we're at time. Okay.
Okay. Thanks.